England's green and pleasant land has become a shade of browny yellow. July in the UK was the driest on record, with large parts of the south experiencing 0 millimetres of rain throughout the month. Images of Blackheath Common, usually verdant, but now looking positively parched, have been going viral. And the football fields of Hackney Marshes, where I walk my dog, now look more like the Nevada desert. Luckily, the trees have stayed green. Plant life does still exist in England, and we're not a desert. But many of the ponds have completely dried up. All of this makes climate change and the prospect of our future on a hotter planet less abstract and more real. But this extreme summer has come alongside a shrug of the shoulders from Britain's politicians, and we haven't heard much from them. Now, earlier this week, Zach Polanski attempted to change that. He demanded that Andy Burnham call an emergency Cobra meeting in response to the drought. Burnham hasn't answered that call. It's not just our government, though, who have responded to this extreme weather with relative quiet. In recent history, the UK has had an incredibly powerful climate protest movement. Extinction Rebellion, which became a global phenomenon for climate action, was founded in the UK. And between 2021 and 2024, Just Stop Oil seemed to be constantly in the news, first for blocking traffic and then for throwing soup on famous paintings. And they also disrupted other arts and cultural events. Of course, Extinction Rebellion has now largely wound up. Just Stop Oil stopped campaigning last year. They said that was to focus on sort of supporting activists either serving or facing jail time. And there haven't been any obvious new climate movements to take their place. Now, this is a reality. The writer Adrian Buller has lamented this week in the New Statesman. The subtitle of the piece reads, "France, Spain and England are burning. Where is the climate movement to resist this catastrophe?" Now, I thought this was an interesting question, so I caught up with Adrian Buller earlier today.
It's a strange movement for climate politics right now, a really weird time, because it feels as though there's in many ways this kind of incredibly fertile ground that you could build action out of. I mean, I think people are really seeing the escalating impacts of the climate crisis so vividly around them, whether that's, the quite sort of shocking imagery of these wildfires in France and Spain and the UK and elsewhere, but also in slightly more kind of mundane quotidian things that really affect sort of everyone on a very basic level, whether that's food and energy prices or, in the heat waves back in June, getting on our bus system where there's absolutely no air conditioning and it's, mostly ridden by the elderly, and you can see them kind of wilting in 40-degree conditions, all these things. So there's all sorts of ways in which the material reality of climate feels more and more acute as time goes on, and yet we have less and less kind of visible climate politics, definitely a sort of absent climate movement relative to the kind of highs of 2019. And it's really sort of difficult to understand why that is. I have all sorts of speculations. And I think, some of the more obvious responses that have been offered, definitely, which have merit, are, COVID initially kind of crushed what was a movement high in 2019, when it was sort of the school strikes, the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and nothing like that has been reconstituted. There's also probably a real sense of fatigue. I mean, when it comes to something like climate, the scale and complexity of this issue is so huge that you are just kind of like beating your head against a brick wall. And when it feels like you're achieving little, it's hard to kind of keep up that momentum. I mean, there's also obviously been a number of crises in the years since that have rightly captured both media attention, but also, the energy of movements, not least kind of the mass mobilization in response to genocide in Gaza. And so those are, I think, some more kind of direct, maybe more obvious reasons. But I think there's also kind of more subtle things going on in the background as well. There's been a real kind of like elite retrenchment on climate. And I mean that from the perspective of positions of power. Obviously, in the US, you have someone like Trump coming in and replacing the Biden administration. But in the UK, Reform, for example, have made attacking net zero a real kind of cornerstone of what they do. And in their sort of desperation to kind of corner Reform voters, both the Tories and Labour have at times kind of reflected that, whether that's in the Conservatives now attacking net zero or Labour kind of being a bit hush-hush about their action on climate, sort of refusing to lead on it. And on the media front, there's been a real decline, a sort of measurable decline in coverage of climate as an issue. And that does sort of impact public perception of how serious this is as a crisis. There's a study by the University of Colorado that found that since 2021, it's fallen by nearly 40% in terms of global news coverage. And that's a massive decline that, has implications. And I think as well, and then I'll stop. I mean, there's so many things we could diagnose, but there's been as well, I think, some very obvious attacks on press freedom, particularly in the US, but also civic freedoms in the UK, with things like, the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, the Public Order Act, the treatment of protesters as terrorists under sentencing law. All of these things were direct responses to the sort of climate movement highs of 2019. Those bills were designed in response to that kind of activism, and they've been quite effective in sort of chilling it. So there are a lot of reasons, just to begin with there. And I think, there are some serious questions about what a climate movement that is reconstituted would actually and could actually look like at this point.
Some people do argue that the decline of a climate movement, or the reduced politicization, let's say, of the climate is a good thing. So you quote in your article the Searchlight Institute, which is a centrist think tank in the United States, and you quote them saying, the first rule about solving climate change is don't say climate change. And I think the argument there is probably twofold, which is if you're a centre-left party and you want to win an election, climate's not a sort of winning issue. But also if you're sort of a generalist climate activist, let's say, or someone who cares about the climate, then it's in your interest for this not to become a polarized issue. And the climate movement, obviously very left-coded, which might help sort of reform or Trump or whoever make this into a political football issue. I take it you don't agree with Searchlight Institute, so sort of tell me why they're wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that there is a really understandable instinct at play there, right? Which is that the right has been incredibly effective at turning climate into a culture war issue. And we being progressive, centrist, people on the left, anyone in that kind of spectrum, we're sort of on the back foot in terms of responding to that very effective, I think, polarization of this issue. And so in some ways, I understand this instinct that they're sort of arguing. I don't know that even their own data sort of reflects that argument. And there's a really great essay in the Boston Review by someone called Aaron Regenberg that sort of dissects a lot of this work really well, which is that, there's this sense that because climate change might not be the number one immediate priority of certain voter groups, that it's somehow also does poorly at the ballot box. And I just don't think those two things are the same. And I think as well, it always calls to mind to me the probably overused Stuart Hall quote, but the quote that is, politics doesn't reflect majorities, it constructs them, right? And so if you don't treat climate change as a major political issue, you don't communicate it as intimately related to things like the cost of living, your grocery bills, your ability to insure your home, your energy bills, wars around the world and the volatility of the fossil fuel system, all of these things. If you fail to make those connections and you fail to state it as a political priority, it will recede as a political priority. You are ceding ground to parties of the right who wish to turn it into a culture war issue, who will use that vacuum to describe it, to deny it, and to set, the terms according to their agenda. And so, I don't think that is a winning strategy. And, evidence from the US, Canada, UK, across Europe suggests that even as public concern has fallen over the past couple of years, as reflected in, various polls, although, polls vary as much as they do, there's the vast majority of people still do care about this as a political issue. And it is a small minority that would be extra keen on a politician that opposes climate action. Those figures remain true. And I think failing to make climate a political issue and to be very strategic and effective in how we communicate it is a huge risk. And I don't think just backing off it as an issue is a great political strategy. And obviously it's a terrible strategy for, the planet and all of the life that lives on it.
All of the life matters, doesn't it?
All the life.
We don't want to lose all of the life. What difference would it make if there were a sort of strong climate movement now? And I suppose, importantly, what would be its demand? What sort of ideas, issues, potential solutions are we not hearing about? Because I suppose the climate movement is currently at a low ebb.
One thing that I've been thinking about is that probably a climate movement going forward will have to look quite different to how it felt and what it looked like in that kind of high period of 2019. And that's not to say we jettison all those kind of traditional protest techniques, but it feels increasingly that there are no easy kind of demands to be made when it comes to climate. Although it's still as important as ever that we get off fossil fuels, the state of the climate that we're in, how far off track we are, how extreme the impacts are becoming day on day, means that that kind of message, it feels really muddied, because we also need to be thinking really seriously about things like adaptation. You know, we live now in an increasingly climate change world, and in the UK, but around the world, you know, we live in societies and in infrastructural systems that are radically ill-equipped for that world. And so now we're in this kind of circumstance where that's happening, where climate is increasingly visibly connected to issues like global conflict. And so it becomes really hard to know exactly how you articulate a very clear demand. It's like we're against the climate crisis, but also creeping authoritarianism, and also war and genocide, and also we need to, and all of that kind of comes together in a very complicated way. And so I think something that provides a really fertile ground for action and that can kind of rebuild coalitions and communities behind and in support of climate action is actually in the realm of adaptation. And by that, I mean, you know, the changes that we need to make to the way that we live, to the infrastructures, to how we organize our communities to respond to this different world that we now live in. A lot of that you can really sort of see, touch, and feel. A lot of it is very embedded in the community. Much of it relates to, you know, the fight for better workplace conditions, whether that's, you know, workers in the NHS where systems buckle under extreme heat, or whether it's, you know, laborers working outdoors in construction in extreme heat conditions. There's all sorts of ways that adaptation links really intimately to things that people feel very strongly about, which they have strong emotional connections to, and which I think can bring in groups that might otherwise be excluded from, say, a mass protest movement behind a kind of new form of climate action. And I think because those actions, climate change has a real kind of scale problem, right? It feels so abstract, both from a temporal perspective, but also a geographical perspective. And these are the kind of actions that can really ground it and make it much more legible to whole different groups of people. So while I'm not sort of saying we shouldn't be hitting the streets and protesting anymore, I do think that we need to be evolving the strategies and tactics that we use.
In the piece in the New Statesman, you're critical of people sort of on the climate scene hyping progress on green tech, so particularly wind and solar rollout. Now, obviously, when I read that, I felt incredibly attacked. So explain your position. Yeah, I to be honest, actually, I'd be flattered if you were thinking of me. But anyway, explain your position there.
Yeah, so it's not that I don't think that we should celebrate wins when they happen, but it's that I think a lot of the celebration of the wins when it comes to sort of the incredible, like, eye-popping build-out of renewable energy that we've seen, largely driven by China around the world. You know, I think we need to be really clear-eyed about how and why that's happening and what it actually means from a climate perspective, which is kind of really the perspective that matters if what we're talking about is, you know, the benefits of clean energy, although access is also a huge benefit there. But, you know, there's a couple things at play there. One of which is that climate is not a problem that is solved just by building a ton of wind turbines and solar panels. That's a big part of it. It's definitely not all of it. And you can really see that in the fact that, you know, that massive build out, impressive as it is, has yet to really make dents in the places that matter, which is sort of materially changing what the energy mix looks like. We still have an unprecedented amount of fossil fuels in the mix because aggregate global energy demand continues to rise. And as a result, we're also not really seeing dents in global emissions in the way that we absolutely need to see for that to really matter. And so while it is a positive story, I worry both about how it's celebrated in terms of prescription of causes. There's a lot of kind of like, oh, well, war has shown us that fossil fuels are volatile and made renewable energy a winner, and like, la-di-da, isn't that great? Ignoring, I think, a lot of other underlying trends and causes. But also, I think we need to be very careful about uncritically celebrating it as something that reflects progress on climate, because while there has been incredible progress in renewable energy, it has yet to translate into real meaningful impacts on cutting emissions. And so it's not that I don't think it's great, but I think that there's a much more sort of complicated picture when it comes to renewable build out.